Hi everyone, this is John McKeever from Data Migrators here with video 3 in a series of videos that will walk you through the installation and configuration of the MettleCI components on your environment. If you haven't already seen the first two videos, please do go and have a look at those. They run in order, so everything that you see today in this video will be the prerequisites for this will effectively be videos 1 and 2. You will remember from previous videos that we've installed our OpenJDK Java that's required for MettleCI components. We've installed and configured the MettleCI workbench, which is what we're looking at here on our sample topology, which is running on a Unix-based engine. Workbench is running on HTTPS, and it's prompting me to onboard a DataStage project. So MettleCI Workbench needs to know about a DataStage project. It needs to know when we are running compliance against a project, where those compliance rules come from, when we commit assets from a DataStage project, where they're going to go to. And that's what we do when we register a project with MettleCI Workbench. So let's go ahead and register our first project. I have a project in my engine. I'm just using DStage 1 at the moment. And I've loaded into there the demo project that I use to run demos. You may remember the job TR orders that I use during demos. This is the project I want to inform MettleCI Workbench of. So on this registered projects page, I'm going to hit plus, and it's going to take me through a wizard. The first step is to select the project we're telling MettleCI about. So I'm going to select DStage 1 and next. And now this is asking for details of a Git repository. There are two repositories we're going to associate with this project. This one here, which is the repository where we're going to store our DataStage assets. So this will be the big one where all of our work goes. And then in the next step, there'll also be another Git repository we're going to tell it about, which is where our compliance rules come from. So we need a Git repository. So today I'm going to use Atlassian Bitbucket as my Git server. I've already created two repositories in here, and I've done nothing more than simply hit plus and give it a name, okay? To create two empty repositories, one for compliance, one for DataStage. So let's start with DataStage. I'm going to click into there, and it's telling me that I have an empty repository and I've got some options for populating that repository. And the option we're going to choose is based on the fact that we already have a local Git repository available to us. And what I mean by that is with MettleCI, we ship two zip files, each of which is a local Git repository. And by that, it's effectively just a local file system that's configured as a local Git repository. The compliance rules repository and the DataStage template, which in this case comes preloaded with a Jenkins pipeline. So I'm going to use this MettleCI Jenkins template file, and I've already stuck that. I'm logged onto this Windows host as the administrator. I've already stuck that into a directory called repos, and there it is, the MettleCI Jenkins template. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply extract that template into that directory, and I'm not going to stick it in a subfolder. I'm just going to extract it there. And so we've now got a folder, MettleCI template. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename that after the name of the repository that I've created, my remote repository I've created in Bitbucket. So I'm going to rename this folder as DemoX DataStage. If I've got an extra space there, yeah, DemoX DataStage, and let's go and have a look at that. So here I am. Let's go cd repos, use Windows commands, and cd DemoX DataStage. So I'm now inside this folder, and you can see there's a .git folder which tells us that this is a Git repository. Now what I want to do, following the instructions in Bitbucket, is to go into this directory. I want to connect this local Git repository to the remote repository, this one we're looking at in Bitbucket, and push its contents up to that repository. The problem is I don't currently have a Git client installed on my Windows host. Now, an important point to remember is that to use MettleCI on a day-to-day basis, you won't need to use Git commands and you won't need a Git command line installed. You will need access to a Git command line in order to perform some of these setup activities, but you don't need Git installed anywhere to use MettleCI day-to-day. And also note that the interface between MettleCI Workbench and Git is built into MettleCI Workbench. MettleCI Workbench doesn't require access to Git commands or a Git install anywhere. It's all built into Workbench. But I will, for now, in order to get us set up, I will need to install a Git command line. So I'm just going to go off and hunt for the Git command line and install it. Okay, so my Git command line is installed and I have restarted my command window. So now I can type the Git command and I've got access to Git. So let's just go back into our repos directory. That's our repository. And what we want to do now is to work on pushing that up into Bitbucket. So there are two ways I can do this. With Bitbucket, I can, and this will vary depending on the Git system that you're using, I can either authenticate myself to Bitbucket using SSH, in which case it gives me a whole bunch of instructions, including a reference to the remote repository as SSH, but that would require me to create a key pair and register one with Bitbucket, and that's a fair bit of hassle given that I actually just want to make this a one-time process. So what I'm going to do with Bitbucket is I'm going to select HTTP and follow these instructions, which gives me an HTTP reference to the remote repository. So I have CD'd into my existing local repository. I'm going to type git init. I'm going to add all of the files, because if I do a git status, you'll see that all the files are currently untracked by Git. So I'll add all files. I will commit those files. Now they are committed locally and ready to be pushed. I need to tell Git where the remote repository is, and here I have my HTTP reference. So that's good, that's recorded. And now I can try to do a push to the master branch, which is the default for this repository. And it's asking for my password. So I'll go off and get my password for that Git repository. And it's pushed. Now if I go back to the repository and refresh, we can see I now have my DataStage template set up, along with, you'll notice, two Jenkins files, which are Jenkins pipeline definitions, one for an upgrade pipeline, one for a DevOps scenario. I will cover those in the Jenkins specific video, but that's worked okay. So now what I'm going to do is exactly the same thing for the compliance repository. So if I just go back to here, we can see that I've also created a DemoX compliance repository. Again, just totally empty. So I'll quickly do the same thing. Okay, so I went through the same process for my compliance repository. I've refreshed that browser view, and you can see I have all of my compliance rules, which from the demo you'll remember are shipped as Gremlin source code. There's an example of a rule there. I won't go through any of these, they're all well documented. There's a whole bunch of rules which we recommend you take a look at, as well as some examples of more complicated rules that you might want to adopt or use as a basis of your own custom rules. So now that's there, I've got my two repositories working. I've got my compliance repository and DataStage repository. Let's go and take those references and stick them into our MettleCI workbench. Okay, so what I need to do is to get a reference to this repository, and in most Git systems you'll get that using the clone button that's somewhere on the UI. So for this I'm actually going to use the SSH reference. So I will copy that SSH reference and paste it into there. The default branch that we are on is master. So I'll stick master in. And the directory where I'm going to keep my DataStage assets is DataStage, all lowercase, which is already set. Next. And it will validate that. And I can't authenticate to that Git repository. And that's understandable. There's absolutely no reason why it should be able to. So if I go back to this Git repository, I need to provide an SSH key to Bitbucket. And there are two ways I can do that. I could either go into my account entry here, and I could say for John McKeever, I want to register an SSH key, and that would be my personal SSH key. But that's not necessarily what I want to do here. What I want to do is to register a shared SSH key that will be used by the Workbench service on our DataStage engine to talk specifically to this repository. So to do that, I'm going to associate the SSH public key with this repository. I'm going to go in Bitbucket, repository settings, access keys, and I'm going to add a key. This key will need to read and write the repository. And where do I get my key value from? Well, we created one as part of the installation of Workbench. So I'm just going to go into PuTTY and jump into an SSH session on my engine. I'm going to go into my Workbench directory, and you can see we've got a workbench key and a workbench.key.pub. So if I cat the workbench.key.pub, and I'll try and do that as using sudo, because I don't have access to it. As EC2 user, I will copy that value out, got it, and paste it into there. Add key. Okay, so Workbench already has the get rid of that, shouldn't have pasted that there. Workbench already has the private key, so if I go back here and attempt to revalidate, you can see that it's validated okay now. So similarly, I'll need to do the same for the compliance repository. And what I'll do here is, before we do that, I will add my public SSH key to the compliance repository. Settings, access keys, add a key. And I can use the same key, and I've still got it in my copy buffer, so I'll add that. And you can see it's got the label Workbench against it, because that's what the label is in the SSH public key. So now we should be able to take this repository's SSH reference, copy that, paste it in there. We're using the master branch, and the path here is the path to where the location of the compliance rules I want to use from the MettleCI Workbench interface. For now, I'm going to leave that empty, but I think we'll come back later on and talk about how we can configure different rules to be used within the Workbench interface versus the different rules you would use for different phases of your CI/CD pipeline. So for now, I'll leave that empty and we'll just go next and that will validate. And we know it's good. The issue management service. So this is where you can configure work item lookup at the point at which you perform a commit. So if you remember when we do the MettleCI demo, when I'm making a commit of my TR orders job into the DataStage repository, I perform a lookup against Jira to associate that commit with a Jira work item, or a Jira story as it's often called. And that's a dynamic lookup live against Jira. And you can configure multiple work item systems. You can look up against GitHub issues, GitLab issues, ServiceNow tickets, and associate them with commits. That's a separate piece of work which I'm going to cover in a separate video. So for now, we're going to select the default generic issue manager, which is basically a placeholder issue management reference that doesn't perform any lookup against a third-party system. It just lets you type a issue reference in, whether it's some code or number or name or whatever. So that means I haven't got anything else to configure. So now I submit and I have my project details recorded here. So what I can now do is go to some other part of MettleCI to test those configurations. So let's start with the simple one. Let's go to Compliance, and I'm going to click on the plus icon here, and I'm going to try and run compliance over a job that I know exists, TR orders. Let's run compliance. Have a look at the logs. You can see that we're connecting to our project repository to get hold of our job. There we go, and you can see that it's discovered the rules in our repository and given us a result. If we just scroll down and look at the logs, you can see that all those rules were discovered and applied to TR orders. So that's good. Now, why don't we try and test the connection to the other repository by making a commit. So I'll go to, I did that quickly, I went to version control plus to do a new check-in, as it's sometimes called. Again, I'll do TR orders. I haven't created any unit tests, so there's no point selecting that checkbox. And work items, I am not connected to a work item system, so I'll just call it test. And to get this dialog to work, you need to type the entry in and then select it from the list. And I'll just call it test commit number 1. Check in, view the logs. Again, this may take a little bit longer than normal on first connection. Okay, we've exported the asset and committed to the repository. So the quick way to check that that's happened is to jump back into Bitbucket. The compliance repository we are effectively treating as a read-only repository, so we won't see any activity there. But if I go to the DataStage repository and have a look at the commit history, we can see that there is my test work item and then test commit number 1. So we are connected to both of our repositories. So the next step is for us to integrate MettleCI Workbench with DataStage Designer by installing those menu items in the Designer's Tools menu item. And so we'll do that in the next very brief video. See you there.